Okay, hello students. Can everyone hear me properly?
Yes,
Yes,
ma'am.
ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Board also clearly? Board देखा वैसा करके?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
So what we were talking in the last class of we were talking about the female gametophytes and the development of the female gametophyte, right? We have started our discussion from the megaspore, functional megaspore to develop like key form ultimately female gametophyte or embryo sac to form and what we know about this embryo sac is the one that we have discussed is a 7-celled 8-nucleate structure. A word to আমি বুঝি পাও last class of এখানে মনে আছে না?
Yes, ma'am.
So 7-celled 8-nucleate structure. So today what we are going to do is we'll be talking about that structure in details. So heading for female gametophyte or embryo sac. So whenever we are going to study about the embryo sac, adjunct scientist or contribution we need to talk about. Talking about the different types of embryo sac because at one type of embryo sac na thake ami last class of jintu porilo 7-celled 8-nucleate structure also tinigua embryo sac thakibo not necessary, right? So a scientist or a worker called as P. Maheshwari, according to him, embryo sac has been classified into different categories. So types of embryo sac আছে আর এই classification from করে দিছিলে P. Maheshwari. Classified the embryo sac on the basis of classified the embryo sac into 3 categories. Monosporic type of embryo sac, bisporic type of embryo sac, and we have in case of monosporic PDQ, to বুজি পাইছানে? এখানে লিখিলো right? So female gametophyte of the embryo set. A classification from Pune is Maheshwari. So you need to remember. So according to Maheshwari, embryo sac could be of three types: monosporic, bisporic, and tetrasporic. এগুলা যে নাম দিছে monosporic, bisporic, or tetrasporic on the basis of what? কোনটো embryo sac of monosporic কম, কোনটো bisporic কম, আর কোনটো tetrasporic কম? I think the line is clear. আমি যেটা লিখিছো, are you understanding the statement? Jadi out of the 4 megaspores, right? এটা megaspore খালি embryo sac to form করে, বাকি যেটা degenerate হয়ে যায়, that type of embryo sac would be called as what? Monosporic type of embryo sac, right? If out of the 4, 2 are functional and they form the embryo sac, then obviously that's bisporic. And with this, harita যদি functional হয়ে থাকে, that they would be called as what? Tetrasporic embryo sac. Is the point clear?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
So A to section of examples is important. Because so polygonum, onothera, elisma are the example. Out of this, maximum question has been asked about these. Because as I example, I mean halke mono bracket. Talking about these three types
Last for example, কি লিখিছে?
Undo,
Last for second to
Fritillaria, Fritillaria, Fritillaria.
last to
Peperomia, Peperomia, Peperomia. Okay. So, and as far as the description of these different types of embryo sac is concerned, multiple course or detailed description nalage. It is only one type of embryo sac that we are going to study in details, and the type that we are going to talk about is polygonal monosporic or monosporic polygonal type of embryo sac. Of course, eta type of embryo sac ke ami ইয়াত পঢ়িব লাগে। এখানে লিখা হল নেকি?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
yes, ma'am.
So
Yes, ma'am.
heading করিবা monosporic polygonal type of embryo sac.
Ma'am,
Please ask.
tetrasporic example কেটা এবাৰ কৈ দিয়কচোন।
Okay, tetrasporic or first example, Adoxa, Adoxa, Adoxa. Second example, Plumbago, Plumbago, Plumbago. Third example, Fritillaria, Fritillaria. L-L-A-R-I-A, fritillaria. And the fourth example is peperomia, P-E-P-E-R-O-M-I-A. Is it clear now?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, heading kora monosporic polygynous type of embryocyte. Right. So which structure are we talking about? Last class of you to Akisu, right? So it's a diagram to our own person.
Yes, ma'am.
Ma'am,
Hmm.
ma'am, boardখন clear হোৱা নাই।
Yes, ma'am.
কাৰো কোৱা নাই না অকল তোমাৰ হোৱা নাই?
Ma'am, এতিয়া আহিছে।
Ma'am, এতিয়া।
So ইয়াতে দেখিবা Is there a network issue?
No, ma'am.
No, ma'am, it's fine.
এইখিনি অকণ সোনকালে লিখা না। A apparatus to আমি এটা থেকে describe কৰিছো we are talking about the single egg in the egg apparatus যেহেতু আমি 7 cells কৈছো ন তিনটা antipodal তিনটা egg apparatus আৰু এটা হ'ল central cell right in the egg apparatus we have one cell that is called as the egg egg term to জানিব লাগিব oosphere right there are two words এটা হ'ল oospore আৰু এটা হ'ল oosphere egg to আমি oospore নকৰিলে Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Ma'am, কাৰোবাৰ mic on হৈ আছে।
Huh?
Ma'am, বেলেগ কাৰোবাৰ mic on হৈ আছে।
যাৰ হেৰি unmute হৈছে please mute কৰি লোৱা disturbance আহিছে ক্লাছটোত দেই Okay so okay oosphere word to মনত ৰাখিবা আৰু as far as the three cells are concerned সবতছে ডাঙৰ cell টো কি egg টোৱে সবতছে ডাঙৰ as compared to the synergy and after fertilization the egg forms the zygote এইখিনিতে বুজাব লগা একো নাই I think it's well understood yes or no
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
okay গোটেইখিনি লিখা হ'ল না বুজিব পাৰো
আমি এইখিনি হোৱা নাই
ঠিক আছে হ'ব Next is the two synergids which are also called as helper cell or cooperative cell, right? আমাৰ mic on হৈ আছে নেকি Okay. Now when we are talking about the egg apparatus, no egg apparatus কি দেখিব এটা egg থাকিব আৰু দুটা synergids থাকিব talking about the synergids you have to remember what is the work of the synergid synergid নামটো আগতে শুনিছা নাই
শুনিছো মেম
শুনিছা so as far as the function is concerned synergid কি function have you heard something called as filiform apparatus
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
synergid cell টোৰ পৰা কিছুমান finger like projections ওলাই আৰু এই finger like projections বিলাকক আমি কি বুলি কৈছো filiform apparatus as far as the function is concerned the filiform apparatus বিলাক কিহৰ কাৰণে ফৰ্ম কৰে বা কি function the main function is to direct the pollen tube right so pollen tube ডাল যেতিয়া সোমাই আহিব ন stigma styleৰে যেতিয়া সোমাই আহি থাকোতে egg to the port আছে exactly where the egg is located so someone needs to guide no যেনেকে আমাৰ traffic police কি কৰে ৰাস্তাটো দেখাই দিয়ে ন যে গাড়ীখন কোনপিনে যাব লাগে ঠিক তেনেকে synergids বিলাকে কি কৰিব synergidৰ পৰা filiform apparatus ওলাই এই filiform apparatus বিলাকে due to the secretion of certain types of chemicals pollen tube যোনডাল penetrate কৰি আছে they will show you the way. So ultimately, function of filiform apparatus is they direct the pollen tube towards the egg. Is the point clear?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Filiform apparatus কি হয়? Finger like projections.
Section.
Our function বহুত বিলাক ফাংশন আছে যেনেকে absorption of nutrients egg to যেহেতু সবতছে ইম্পৰ্টেন্ট সেল egg to ডাঙৰ হ'ব লাগিলে তাক nutrients লাগিব আৰু absorption of nutrients কোনে হেল্প কৰিব filiform apparatus বিলাকেও absorption of হেল্প কৰে কিন্তু মেইন ফাংশন So, it's important. What are we talking about this? If suppose we are talking about this as the egg, right? Our black hole synergies. So synergies are for finger-like projections level. Right? So A level coming in also filiform apparatus. What is this? Synergy, P2P synergy, and this is the egg. What idea by so?
Yes, ma'am.
So filiform apparatus of question ahe. And another question ahe the filiform apparatus is a characteristic of which cell? This is a characteristic of synergy. Next, we have to write something about the antibody cells, which are also called as vegetative cells. You have to basically they degenerate before or after fertilization. They are also helps in absorption of nutrients. So antibody cells in black form kore tahate absorption of help korbo and gradually they will degenerate. So we have talked about this egg apparatus, we have talked about the antibody cells. What we are left with is the central cell. So heading for the central cell.
আমি to absorption লিখিছে নেকি also help
Absorption of nutrients. Next,
ma'am last point to one আছিল
last point what is it?
নাই হোৱা
Last point is they also help absorption. They also help in absorption of nutrients.
Ma'am, can you speak in English? I can't understand.
Yes, yes.
Can you speak in English?
Yeah, which is the part you did not understand?
No, I understand, but some words I didn't understand, like synergy and all this.
Like
Synergy part I didn't understand.
synergy
Like
part you did not understand. Okay, I'll just go. I'll repeat once more. Okay, see, when we are talking about this structure, right? We have an egg and we have two synergids. This one is a synergid and this one is a synergid, right? So if suppose we are talking about this as the embryo sac, and this is the egg, and this is the synergid. Okay, this is the synergid, and this is another synergid. So what is the function of the synergid? From this cell, some finger-like projections will come out, right? So this cell will, suppose this is a synergid. From here, some finger-like projections will come out, right? So this cell is called as synergid. From the synergid, these structures that are finger-like projections will come out, and these are called as filiform apparatus. Is it clear now?
Ma'am, cellular vacuoles কোনবিলাকক কয়? Cellular vacuoles কোনবিলাকক কয়?
Telagel vacuole.
Mm.
So, দুটা word. One student is asking me about maybe most probably synergid, and you are asking me about cellular vacuole. Yes? Take my question, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I'll come to this one. Let me first explain this one. To the student who did not understand, are you getting the picture now? Can you understand now? What is a synergid? And from the synergid, what comes out is filiform apparatus. Is it clear?
Yes, ma'am.
What? Okay. Now coming to the function of filiform apparatus. Did you understand the function?
Filiform, yes, ma'am.
What is the function?
It direct the pollen tube growth inside the embryo sac.
It will direct the pollen tube towards the embryo sac. Means what? Okay, suppose I'll draw it. Suppose we are talking about this is sigma, this is the style, and this is the ovary. Inside the ovary, we have the ovule, right? And suppose we have the egg apparatus here. This is the synergid and this is the synergid. When we are talking about this pollen tube, the pollen grain, this pollen grain will develop its pollen tube, and this pollen tube needs to come and fertilize the egg. Now, the pollen tube, after entering the style, will not know as to where the egg exactly is located. So what will the synergids do? The synergids will develop certain finger-like projections, and they will synthesize certain chemicals, and because of this, this pollen tube will know that it has to come through this way. So this is a synergid. The synergid will develop filiform apparatus. Filiform apparatus are finger-like projections, right? So these are finger-like projections. So they will synthesize certain chemicals, and because of this chemical, the pollen tube will get attracted, and ultimately it will reach the egg. Is it clear?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, for the next student who is asking about the cellular vacuole, right? Cellular vacuole means what? The vacuole that is present at the cellular area. If you're talking about this as the ovule, right? So if you're talking about this as the ovule, microbile, and this area would be called as what? The cellular. This is the microbile, this area is the cellular. So if you have a vacuole at this position, right? Gycogami ki boli ko? Right? Depending on where will you find the vacuole. If suppose taking the vacuole to affect, micropilar vacuole. It's just about the position. Where will you find the vacuole? Right? Either you will find the vacuole in the cellular area, or you will find the vacuole in the micropilar area. Is the point clear?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Any more doubts?
No, ma'am.
Next, coming to this cell, the central cell, just right. The central cell is the
ইয়াতো cellular vacuoleৰ একো function নাই নহয়। মানে এটো বেসিকল সেলাজেল ভেক্টৰটো একো ফাংশন নাই
No, nothing. Obviously, it will help in storing and enlargement of the cell. That is different, right? But from embryo cell point of view, we will only need
ওকে ম্যাম
asking you a question. Like our mic to unmute হয়েছে.
মাইক অন হয়ে গেছে
আনমিউট হয়ে আছে
Okay, for those who has put their mic unmute, sune kori rakhis, please let me take the task properly. Disturbance ahi jay. Mute korile na dia?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So you need to remember this. Out of in this structure, this is totally the embryo sac. In this embryo sac, the largest cell is supposed to be the central cell. So question that is asked is which cell is considered as the largest cell of the embryo sac? The central cell is the largest cell of the embryo sac. Right. Next. Initially, it contains two polar nuclei. Initially, it contains two polar nuclei which fuses just before fertilization and forms secondary nucleus or definitive nucleus. Right? So we are talking about the central cell. So in this diagram, what we can see is this central cell has two nuclei. So we are talking about stages before fertilization, right? So when we are talking about the starting of the embryo sac, then obviously the central cell will have two nuclei, but later or just before fertilization, what will happen? This two nuclei will fuse together to form a bigger nucleus, and that bigger nucleus is called as secondary nucleus or definitive nucleus. Is the point clear?
Yes, ma'am.
Right? And as far as this word is concerned, polar nuclei, what we understand by the term polar nuclei? In this diagram, is this the diagram of two polar nuclei or this is the diagram of secondary nucleus? Diagram two polar nuclei, secondary nucleus.
polar nucleus.
It is
two polar
this diagram represents the presence of what? Two polar nuclei because they are in unfused condition. There are two nuclei that are separate, right? When they will come together and fuse, after that we will be using the word that is called a secondary nucleus. Now coming to the ploidy of the cells. Is this part clear? Any question from this part?
No, ma'am.
ও ম্যাম
Okay. Then now coming to the ploidy of these cells, when we are talking about the egg, what would be the ploidy? N. First, so we need to remember this entire thing. The embryo sac or ploidy kiman hobo? What will be the ploidy of the embryo sac? If you are asking that just in a broader sense, no, except the central cell, all the cells will have haploid number of chromosomes or they will be N, right? So egg is N, synergy is N, antipodal cells would also be N, each cell would be N except the central cell. The central cell, since they will have two polar nuclei and this nuclei will fuse together, ultimately they will have a ploidy of twice N. Is the point clear?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So this is the most common type of embryo sac that we have to talk about within our course, right? So up till here, what we have studied is we have talked about the male reproductive part. We have talked about the pollen grain microspores, right? We have talked about the development of the male gametophyte or development of the microspore. We have used certain words called as shedding at 2-cell condition and shedding at 3-cell condition. We know if the pollen grain has to shed, or if the time of the pollen grain is to shed, then obviously the female reproductive part should also be ready, right? If only both the structures are ready at the same time, then only proper fertilization will take place. Yes or no? এটা ready হৈছে এটা
Yes.
ready হোৱা নাই হ'ব নেকি fertilization?
No.
No.
No,
Right?
ma'am.
So if one part is ready, or maybe the male part is ready, the female part is not ready, or vice versa, then obviously it will not call for fertilization. So in order to conduct fertilization, both the male reproductive part and the female reproductive part should mature, right? Or should be ready. So we have talked on one hand about the pollen grain. Now we have talked about the embryo sac. So the pollen grain is also ready. Now the egg is also ready. What next? Obviously fertilization. Now talking about fertilization, we know in case of higher organisms, especially in case of higher plants, when we are talking about sexual reproduction ki hobo, they will always need an agent, or we have to talk about something called as pollination, right? Fertilization hobo lagile ki hobo lagibo, pollination hobo lagibo, yes or no?
Yes, yes.
Yes, ma'am.
Fertilization to occur. Prior to fertilization, what should happen? Pollination. Yes. So the next topic that we are going to study is pollination. Talking about pollination, the first question, why pollination is necessary? First, pollination क्यों necessary?
Pollination হলে হে
Fertilization. For
part
fertilization.
Transfer of
Fertilization কাৰণে pollen grain to লৈ যায়
pollen can
Fertilization
act
kind of,
pollen can act as male spore male gametospore male
yeah,
gametes.
pollen grain is a male gamete, right? Okay, pollen grain contains a male gamete. Embryo sac contains the female gamete, right? Then we are concerned with fertilization. So male gametes should fuse with the female gamete. But before fertilization, pollination is necessary. Now, why is pollination necessary? Pollination no hole, fertilization hobone no.
No hoy.
Yes, in
ma'am.
some plants which have both male and female gametes, bisexual plants.
Except few exceptions, right? We obviously will have to
Yes.
talk about certain types of exceptions, but in general, we are talking about the novel type of sexual reproduction that we see in case of angiosperms. Before fertilization, ki hobo lagibo? Pollination obviously hobo lagibo. Yes or no?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
So the question was, why pollination is essential?
pollen tube
For
কতটা হয়ে পড়ে
variation.
For transferring of male gametes,
pollen
For
tube কতটা হয়ে
transferring
পড়ে
of,
male gametes. For transferring of male gametes, ma'am.
To produce variety in plants.
Easily pollen
Ma'am.
grain stigma jai karna.
for the
Ma'am, without
transfer of
pollination-
male gametes.
Enter into
Ma'am, without pollination, the anthers cannot reach the stigma of different flowers or same flower, and hence fertilization is not occurs, which leads to the absence of zygote.
Very good. Okay, the question was, what is the need of pollination? So you all said that the male gametes need to be transferred to the female gamete, and that is the reason why pollination is required. Now, another question is, why male gamete has to be carried to the female gamete? Nije jabo nore niki? Are you understanding the question?
They need a medium.
Can the male gametes reach the female gametes all by themselves in case of angiospermic plants or in case of higher plants?
No.
Pollination ki hoy. What is pollination? The transfer of pollen grain from one flower to the stigma of another flower. That is what is supposed to be the definition of pollination. So the pollen grain needs to be carried from one place to the other place. Now the point is, why do you have to carry the pollen grain? Pollen grain to क्यों carry करना पड़े? निजे सब बनवाने नहीं. Can't the pollen grain go by themselves?
No, ma'am.
No, ma'am.
No, ma'am.
Why? Why? Are you understanding? Pollination is necessary. What is pollination? Transfer of pollen grain to the stigma. And for this transfer to occur, you need certain type of agencies. Now the point is, why do the pollen grains needs to be transferred? Can't they go all by themselves? There's a simple answer to that. The simple answer is pollination is necessary, agency is necessary because both the gametes are non-motile. If suppose they are motile, then obviously they will walk or they will swim to the female gamete. But since the gametes of higher plants are non-motile, so it has to be carried from one plant to the other. Is the point clear?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Transfer of pollen grain. PG2 what? Pollen grain is available. So I think it's understood, right? Their full form likhi bole ibo. Do I have to write the full form or it's understood?
Understood.
Okay. Right? So that's the first one. In flowering plants, of কি হয়? So why pollination is necessary? Because the gametes are non-motile in case of higher plants. Is the point clear? Yes.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Now, talking about types of pollination, when we are talking about types, we know pollination could be of two types. Either it is self-pollination or cross-pollination. So if pollination occurs within the same plant, then it is called as self-pollination. If pollination occurs between two different plants, it is called as cross-pollination. Now talking about self-pollination, there are two terms. One second. Autogamy and metallogamy, right? And cross-pollination is also called as Gycogami or allogamy, right? So cross-pollination or duta naam. So cross-pollination or kotha ki jano? It occurs between two different plants, right? As far as autogamy is concerned and metogamy is concerned, autogamy ki jano? Pollination, same flower, same plant. I'm writing it in a very short form, okay? And if you're talking about metogamy, then it is also a type of self-pollination where pollination occurs between different flowers
Same flower.
of the same plant. Right? So we have, right? So if pollination occurs here, this is autogamy. If you're talking about methanogamy, maybe we are talking about a flower here, and we are talking about a flower here, pollination will occur here. So this is called as methanogamy, but obviously of the same plant. Right? And if you're talking about cross-pollination, we have a flower here, we have another flower here, and this is the pollination. So if you draw a diagram, it will become easier. There is no point of by-hearting the sentences. Is the point clear? If a doubts আছে নেকি?
No, ma'am.
হ'ল নেকি?
All
Yes,
ma'am.
ma'am.
Okay. Now, whether a plant will undergo self-pollination or it will undergo cross-pollination. Suppose you are thinking of a plant, hey plant alor, কি হব? Cross-pollination হব নে self-pollination হব? কিহৰ ওপৰত depend কৰিব? The question is whether a plant will undergo self-pollination or cross-pollination, who will decide?
The presence of pollen grain.
Presence of?
Pollen grains.
No, in both the types of
Yes.
pollination, either we are talking about self or we are talking about cross. In both the two types, pollen grains needs to be present. So I don't think that's the correct answer. Okay, the first question is,
plants by
yeah, we have certain conditions, right? If a plant shows certain types of conditions, then it will undergo self-pollination. If it has some other type of conditions, then it will undergo cross-pollination, right? So we have to talk about what are the conditions that will help a plant to undergo self-pollination and what are the conditions that will help a plant to undergo cross-pollination. All of a sudden, the plants cannot decide that I want to undergo self-pollination, let's undergo self-pollination. I want to undergo cross-pollination, so let's undergo cross-pollination. Nothing of that sort. So what you need to understand is, in a particular plant, there should be certain conditions, right? We'll be talking about some words called as unisexual class, bisexual class, terms like homogamy, heterogamy, heterocycly, etc., etc. So ultimately, what we have understood is, in order that a plant undergoes which type of pollination depends on the conditions that are present in the plant. First thing. Second point is, from quality point of view or from importance or from beneficial point of view, which type of pollination do you think is more beneficial? Self-pollination or cross-pollination?
Cross-pollination.
Pollination.
It is always cross-pollination that is supposed to be beneficial. And what is the reason behind?
It produce varieties of flowers, variation in plants.
Yeah, it will be
Can find better variety.
certain types of variations, right? When we are talking about self-pollination, in self-pollination also, since we are talking about sexual reproduction, self-pollination is a type of sexual reproduction. When we talk about sexual reproduction, obviously we'll be talking about variations, because whenever any organism undergoes sexual reproduction, offsprings will occur mazor. Obviously, we will see variation. So in case of self-pollination, also we'll see variation. In case of cross-pollination, also we'll see variation. But the point is, if a plant undergoes self-pollination continuously for generations after generations, it will lead to a condition called as inbreeding depression. Have you heard this word? Continuous
Yes, ma'am.
self-pollination is key for it. leads to inbreeding depression. What is inbreeding depression? The simple meaning of this is the quality of the offsprings will deteriorate. That is what is called as inbreeding depression. So if a plant undergoes cross-cell pollination continuously for many generations together, then after the last generation, or maybe after the last step, or maybe we are talking about the offsprings that are produced, right? After chemically or biologically, they will be less fit as compared to the offspring that is produced by cross-pollination. So if we are comparing two offspring, one offspring of a plant who has undergone self-pollination for ages and another offspring who has undergone cross-pollination, দুইটাৰে offspring থাকিব, which one will be biologically fit? Obviously, biologically, it will be fit, কোনটো fit হ'ব? Cross-pollination or যোনটো offspring হয়, that will be more biologically fit. As far as this is concerned, continuous self-pollination will decline the quality of the offspring, and that is what is called as inbreeding depression. Here.
Yes, ma'am.
But in spite of this, we see so many plants that undergo self-pollination. কিছুমান conditions থাকিলে self-pollination এনেও হ'ব, right? The plant cannot stop it. The plant cannot decide that since we will have inbreeding depression, let's not go for self-pollination. You cannot decide like that, right? So if certain conditions are present, then in that plant, the type of pollination that you will see is always self-pollination. So the next thing that we are going to study is what are the conditions that favor self-pollination? Right? Key condition of self-pollination.
And clastogamous flowers থাকিলে হয় নেকি?
Oh, clastogamous like clistogamous.
Yes.
Clastogamous flowers থাকিলে cross-pollination হোৱাৰ chance থাকে. Clistogamous flowers থাকিলে self-pollination হয়. We'll come to that point. ঠিক আছে, আমি আহি আছো। হেডিং কৰিবা। So what are the factors that will enhance the plant to undergo self-pollination? The first factor that we talk about is bisexuality. What we understand by this term?
Male and
Male,
If
female.
a plant,
Both males and female flowers
Male
should
আৰু
be
female
present.
একেটা ফ্লাৱাৰতে থাকে।
very good. So if a plant has bisexual flowers, then chance কি থাকিব? Self-pollination or cross-pollination. There will be every chance of undergoing self-pollination. So bisexuality is one condition that will encourage self-pollination. Is the point clear? Right? So if the plants are bisexual, the type of pollination that we generally undergo is self-pollination. And if you're talking about bisexual flowers, example could be Vicky rose, right? So the first condition that encourages self-pollination is bisexuality. We come to the second condition. Homogamy means what? In a bisexual flower, if suppose we are talking about a bisexual flower, what is a bisexual flower? Both male part and the female part are present in the same flower. But in spite of that, if both the parts do not mature at the same time, will self-pollination occur?
No, ma'am.
no,
No, ma'am.
Understand the question? Right? So for self-pollination to occur, bisexual হলেই নহব. They have to be bisexual. Together with that, homogamy should also occur. What is homogamy? Both the sexes should mature at the same time. Clear?
Yes, ma'am.
this is the second condition. Third condition is Clistogamy. Clistogamous flower মানে কি? Closed flower. And just the opposite is
Casmogamy.
Casmogamous flower. Yeah, which is called as
Open.
flower. Now, what do you understand by the term closed flower and open flower? And মানে কি?
Flower does not open before pollination.
What we understand by the term opening of a flower means what? Which part are we talking about?
The petals.
Yes. If you are talking about not only the petals, sepals, everything, because if suppose we are talking about a flower which does not open, means what? The petals will not open. As a result, the reproductive parts will not get exposed. In order to undergo cross-pollination, what is very much essential is the reproductive parts, Ambrosium and Gynostium, should get open so that the insects or maybe by various agencies, they will get pollinated. If we are talking about a flower that never opens, the petals never opens up, then the reproductive parts will always remain covered by the petals. And so what is the option they are left with is always self-pollination. So in case of a clistogamous flower, or in case of clistogamy, where the plant shows clistogamy, the only option that they are left with is always self-pollination. Clear?
Yes, ma'am.
Ma'am, example you. Ma'am, repeat. Repeat the last one.
What is the question? I did not get the question. Can you repeat it again?
Ma'am,
Ma'am, Clistogamy.
One by one. Oh, clistogamy কি?
আকৌ এবাৰ বুজাই দিয়ক মেম।
Okay. আৰু কোনে সুধিছিলে?
ma'am, cleistogamy to inside the soil,
Oh. Yes, we'll have the example of a groundnut. Because a groundnut or badam, no, inside the soil. Okay,
Yes.
Clistogamy means what? You have a flower, right? So flower ki thake? You have the petals, and if you are talking about a flower like this, right? So you have the female reproductive part and you have the male reproductive part. When can you see these two parts? When the petals are open. Are you understanding? If a flower is in the form of a bud, যেতিয়া সৰু হৈ থাকে কলিৰ নিচিনা হৈ থাকে আমি এন্ড্ৰোশিয়াম গাইনোচিয়াম দেখা পাও নেকি?
No.
Can you see? No. When will you be able to see the reproductive part of a flower? Only when the petals get open. If the petals are in a fused condition, right, or if they are closed condition, then you cannot see the parts from above, right? So in order to see those reproductive parts, the petals needs to open up, right? There are certain flowers in which the petals never open up. And so they are called as closed flowers, and the term that we use is called as clistogamous flowers. So these are flowers whose petals never open up. If the petals do not open up, then androecium and gynoecium will be all covered by the petals, and so they are forced to undergo self-pollination and not cross-pollination. Is the point clear?
Ma'am, ক্লাইষ্টগamy ফ্লাৱাৰবিলাক ক্লোজড হয় ন, কিন্তু সেইবিলাকৰ মানে পলিনেশন কেনেকৈ হয়? মানে কোনটো মিডিয়ামৰ দ্বাৰা পলিনেশন হয়?
Self-pollination. Self-pollination হ'বলৈ তো মিডিয়াম নালাগে, তাহাঁতৰ পেটেলছৰ ভিতৰতে হৈ গ'ল। Right? Cross-pollination হ'বলৈহে আমাক agencies বিলাক লাগিব, যেনেকৈ water, air, insects, animals, etc., etc. So you have one flower, you have both the two reproductive parts. So নিজে নিজে কৰি যাব। So in case of clistogamy,
Okay, ma'am. Thank you.
understood?
Ma'am.
Please ask.
Ma'am.
Ma'am, homogamy to যদি homogamy to ma'am both part যদি একেলগে mature নহয়ও তো তথাপিও pollination to হ'ব পাৰে ন মানে fertilization নহব কিন্তু pollination to হ'ব পাৰে
যদি দুইটা part mature একেলগে নহয়, if homogamy does not take place, then that flower is forced to undergo cross pollination. Right? So যদি homogamy হয় তেতিয়াহে self pollination হ'ব। যদি homogamy নহয় self pollination will not take place. If homogamy occurs, then only self pollination will take place. If homogamy is not seen, then self pollination will not take place. Instead, they will have to wait for cross pollination. Clear?
Okay, ma'am.
Any more questions?
Madam, homogamy হলে মানে এন্থাৰৰ পৰা তো স্টিগমা লৈকে যাব লাগিব ন হেতু কি দৰে হ'ব
পৰি যাব ন এন্থাৰটো যেতিয়া ফাটি যাব ফাটি গলে এটা জৰ্কত পলিন গ্ৰেইনছ বিলাক ওলাই যাব না যায়
যাব
তো সেই জৰ্কটো যেতিয়া ওলাই গৈ ফাটি পেলাই ওলাই গৈ তো ক'বাত পৰিবগৈ
মানে ম্যাডাম মানে স্টিগমাটোতকৈ যেটো এন্থাৰ হেতু বেছি দীঘল হ'ব লাগিব মানে ওখ হ'ব লাগিব
Yeah, we'll be coming to that point also. যদি proper height of থাকে তেতিয়াহে self pollination হ'ব if suppose we are talking about anther বহুত তলত আছে stigma বহুত ওপৰত আছে তেতিয়া কি হয় self pollination হ'বলৈ দিগদাৰি হয় তেতিয়াহলে কি হ'ব লাগিব cross pollination because that pollen grains will not reach the stigma so we have to talk about that proper height also ঠিক আছে
thank you
বুজি পাইছা নাই
পাইছো ma'am
yes or no
yes ma'am
okay
yes,
okay
ma'am.
I think I answer ঠিক আছে any more questions
No,
আৰু questions আছে নেকি নাই এতিয়া from examination point of view কি question আহে out of these এইবিলাক conditions to আমি পঢ়িম question আহিব পাৰে if for self pollination to occur the type of flower that is necessary unisexual or bisexual so you have to underline or you have to take the word bisexual similarly second question is asked maybe it will be asked about histogamy out of everything maximum question has been asked about this point key question I said only the examples from entrance point of view the examples of histogamous class are very important here our example অকল আমি এই তিনটাই চাম আৰু বেলেগ example নালাগে it's always viola comelina and oxalis out of this সবতছে question যদি আহিছে comelina ৰ ওপৰত আহিছে so example is something that you have to by heart
ma'am protoloca to example হয় ন
হা
protoloca
আমি আহি আছো examples আৰু বেলেগকে ঠিক আছে
Ma'am, sesamogamous flower example কি হ'ব?
Sesamogamous বা Castogamous flowers এটা point আমি ক'ব পাৰো that these examples that we have talked about viola আৰু comelina and oxalis এইবিলাক planter two types of flowers থাকে Castogamous থাকে Histogamous থাকে it was one type of example as far as general examples are concerned any flower that opens up to be an example of a Castogamous class hibiscus Castogamous right first it stays in the form of a bud and then the petals open up so if a flower opens up that's an example of a Castogamous the normal flowers that we see where all the petals are opened up would be an example of a Castogamous flower
Okay, ma'am. Ma'am, এই তিনিটা বাদ দি যেকেইটা থাকিব সেইকেইটাই sesamogamous হ'ব ন মানে এই তিনিটা এক্সাম্পল সাপোজ ভায়োলা কামেলিনা আৰু অক্সালিস এই তিনিটা বাদে মানে যিমান কিটা মানে ফ্লাৱাৰ হ'ব ওপেন ফ্লাৱাৰ গটেকিটা তো সেসমোগামাছৰ এক্সাম্পলত আহি যাব
maximum flowers নহয় not necessary that Castogamous or all এই তিনটাই examples আছে there are so many other examples also but we will be reading only three of them কিন্তু the normal flowers আমি যোনবোৰ দেখো for example lotus Castogamous sunflower Castogamous hibiscus Castogamous here
Okay, ma'am. Thank you.
Next, there was a third condition. No, we are talking about conditions necessary for cell pollination. Tita condition for you. Next is the fourth condition. So we have something called as bud pollination. Bud pollination means there are certain plants in which pollination occurs at the bud stage itself. In general conditions, what we know, if you're talking about pollination, pollination ketia hoy in the flower condition. Budor pora flower hobo, flower or pisot he ki hobo, pollination hobo. Right? A bud will get transformed into a flower and only after that pollination will take place. But in certain types of plants, pollination occurs during the bud condition itself. So if suppose again we are talking about a bud, then obviously the reproductive parts will be enclosed within the bud, and so chances ki thake cross pollination hobo jabo. Obviously self pollination will occur. Clear?
Yes, ma'am.
Go back, Bosu. Ma'am, Akobar Kobo etu.
Bud pollination, no, statement is also pollination occurs in the bud before opening of a flower. Okay, let me tell you again. So we are talking about a special type of pollination that is called as bud pollination. What is bud pollination? Normally, normal plants pollination ketia hoy. Eta colid hoy, me eta flower hoy. Pollination of in normal cases, pollination occurs in a bud or it occurs in a flower.
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 It occurs in a flower. Now, what is the difference between a bud and a flower?
Bud is a baby. Baby.
But to the first stage to a flower.
Immature and mature. We can use the words. The immature stage or the starting stage is the bud. The mature stage is the flower. So in normal conditions, pollination occurs after the flower becomes mature, or in the matured condition where all the parts of the flower are fully formed, all the parts are fully exposed. Only after that pollination occurs. That is something that is very, very commonly observed. But there are certain exceptions. What is the exception? In certain types of plants like rice, wheat, etc., the flower never opens up, right? We cannot say that to be a closed flower. That is something which we don't use the word closed or open. Closed open. But obviously the meaning is almost the same as a closed flower. And flower to closed flower. But that is not the term that we use here. So instead, what we say, this pollination occurs in that immature condition itself. That is when the flower is in the form of a bud, right? So when pollination occurs in the bud before opening of a flower, right? The flower can open, but it does not open. What is the difference? This is clistogamous and this one. In case of clistogamy flowers or in case of clistogamous flowers, the flower will never open. But in this case, the flower will open. But pollination before opening of the flower, the pollination takes place. Are the two terms understood?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
So rice, wheat, pisum, etc. These are examples of bud pollination. So up till here, what we have discussed is we have talked about certain factors that encourages self-pollination. Means what? If a plant has to undergo self-pollination, then it should have certain conditions. And what are the conditions that we have studied? We have talked about bisexuality, we have talked about homogamy, clistogamy, and about bud pollination. A চাৰিটা যদি condition থাকে, if these four conditions are present, then obviously the plant will undergo self-pollination. Clear?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Next, we have to talk about the factors that encourages cross-pollination. Consequences of cross-pollination or the factors that encourages cross-pollination. Both have the same meaning. So what would be the first condition? So in case of cross-pollination, we have used the word unisexuality. If suppose the plant has unisexual flowers, then it will undergo cross-pollination. If a plant has bisexual flowers, it will undergo self-pollination. So here I have first key for it, unisexuality. Unisexuality is also called as dichly. Means what? Either the flowers is the line understood? Just go through the line. Is this line understood?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
Just finish off. Right? So the first condition for the plant to undergo cross-pollination is unisexuality. Second, we see a factor called as male sterility. You are talking about a flower. In that flower, if the male reproductive part is sterile, then obviously self-pollination no hoy, like cross-pollination hobo. So I don't think there is much to be explained or to write in this point. Is this point understood? So if the male reproductive part is sterile, then the plant will always undergo cross-pollination. Here, nothing to write.
Yes, ma'am.
Unisexuality, okay. I think it's over, right? Unisexuality example kita monu praktika de papaya and legislator. The third condition is
Ma'am, second number to akobar kobo.
kuntu.
Second number 2, male sterility.
Second number has nothing to be explained. It is called as male sterility. We are talking about a flower in which the male reproductive part is sterile. We understand the meaning of sterile. Sterile মানে
Fruit দিব নোৱাৰে।
fertilize কৰিব নোৱাৰে. It cannot fertilize, does not have the capacity to fertilize. That is what is called as sterile. So if you are talking about a flower in which the male reproductive part is sterile, then what will happen? Will the flower undergo self-pollination? Pollination হবই নোৱাৰে কাৰণ it is sterile or the pollen grains will be inefficient. Right? So in that case, what is the option left with? Is always cross-pollination. So if the male part is sterile, the plant will always undergo cross-pollination instead of self-pollination. Clear?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Next, the third question, third factor. a term called as dichogamy. We have talked about homogamy, right? This is just the opposite of homogamy. Homogamy ki asile? The sexes mature at the same time. What is dichogamy? The sexes mature at two different times. Maybe the androecium will mature first, or maybe the gynoecium will mature first. Eketa time of the mature no correct. That is what is called as dichogamy. Here. So when we are talking about dichogamy, we have to use two words, proto-andry or proto-gyne. What is proto-andry? It is a condition where androecium or the male part matures first. What is protogyne? In such type of a flower, the female part or the gynoecium matures first. Is the concept clear? मुझे पाइसोलेट नहीं हुआ.
Yes, ma'am.
Right? So if in the plant you see homogamy, the plant will undergo self-pollination. If in the plant you see dichogamy, then the plant will undergo cross-pollination. If you're talking about dichogamy, either proto-andry is the condition that will be observed or protogyne will be the condition. In case of proto-andry, the androecium matures first, the gynoecium is not ready. Similarly, in case of protogyne, the gynoecium is ready, but the androecium is not ready. I think the concept is clear.
Yes, ma'am.
So this was the third condition. Can I wrap the board?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Everyone, so where likha ho likini?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
I know. ठीक है, doesn't matter. लिखी लो. So एकने लिखा. That is the third condition, and then we move to the fourth condition. We have something called as harcogamy. एकने लिखी लो आगे में. और बोले वो कोबा.
মেম হৈছে
কাবাৰ যে হোৱা নাছিলে?
হৈছে
হৈছে? Okay. Harcogamy মানে কি? মই এটা sentence লিখিম. I'll write a sentence. Please go through the sentence. Presence of a natural barrier. Barrier মানে কি? What is the meaning of barrier?
বাধা
Barrier মানে obstruction. Yeah. Right? So we see a condition that is called as harcogamy. What is harcogamy? Sometimes in a bisexual flower, What we'll see in a bisexual flower, both the male part and the female part, right? Or maybe in one flower, what you see is between the androecium and the gynoecium, there is a group of tissues that will act as a barrier. If suppose there is a barrier between the both reproductive parts, then obviously cell pollination is not possible. Clear? So there are certain examples in which we see the presence of a barrier between the androecium and the gynoecium. If a barrier is present, cell pollination will not take place. And that phenomenon is called as Gycogami. One example of a barrier is at a barrier or example of a natural barrier is a structure called as Gynostatia. And this Gynostatia or the natural barrier is seen in a plant called as Calotropis. Right? Gynostatia keyword. It is the natural barrier, right? Because of which self-pollination does not take place. Now, what is the meaning of gynostatia? Gynostatia means what? So, you have the male part, you have the female part. Between the male and the female part, you have a structure that acts as an obstruction, right? That structure, one example of a natural barrier is gynostatia. Not necessary. When we talk about natural barrier, it is always gynostatia that is present. There might be so many different types of natural barrier, but we are talking about just one type of a natural barrier, that is gynostatia. What is gynostatia? It is a structure that is formed when the gynoecium remains fused when the gynoecium of a flower remains fused with the pollidium of the flower. That structure is called as gynostatia. Now, to understand this part, you need to know the meaning of pollidium. And pollidium is something that I think we have explained in the last class. Do you remember the meaning of pollidium? Maybe last or last to last class. Just try to remember, we have talked about certain terms when we were talking about the pollen grain development. We have used certain terms called as compound pollen grain. First point. Second point, we have talked about pollidium. What we remember about pollidium is it is a common characteristic that is seen in case of orchids. And I think I have said also that this point is important, and the best example is always orchids. You have to remember this example. So, do you remember what a pollidium is?
Pollens are developed inside the
The pollens are
developed inside the bag-like structure.
Pollen grains remain enclosed in special structures called pollinia.
Please repeat.
Pollen grains
remain attached
in special structures called pollinia.
Remain united.
They remain united.
Microspore united.
Yeah, that is the correct answer. If you remember, or if you just go through the notes that you have previously written, where John Pollidium you will see a statement where we have written it like this: the microspores of one anther lobe remains connected to form pollidium. Not
Yes. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, that lobes we have talked about: unilobed anther, bilobed anther. So in case of a bilobed anther, how many lobes will you see? Two lobes. So at the lobe, if all the microspores remains fused or remains attached together, that structure is called as what? Pollidium. So sometimes what happens? The gynoecium of the flower remains attached with the pollidium of a flower, and ultimately the new structure that they form is called as gynostagium. And whenever gynostagium is present, it will act as a natural barrier that will prevent self-pollination. Is the point clear?
Yes, ma'am.
Everyone, বুঝি পাইছানে সবে?
Ma'am.
Doubts আছে যদি সোধা।
পলিনিয়ামটো আকৌ এবাৰ কৈ দিব।
পলিনিয়ামটো ন চোৱা আমি এন্থাৰৰ কথা পাতিছিলো ন এন্থাৰটো জানো ষ্টেমেন এডালত কি থাকে এন্থাৰ এটো কি হয় এন্থাৰ আমি টু টাইপস কৰিছিলো ইউনিলোবড বাইলোবড yes or no মন আছে না এখিনি
Yes, ma'am.
right so inside this anther when you go for a ts to আমি কেনেকুৱা দেখা পাম something like this remember
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
right so this is one lobe this is another lobe inside the anther or inside this structure what will you see the microspores yes or no
Yes, ma'am.
right if all the microspores of one anther lobe remains fused together so normally microspores will ki hoy once the microspores are formed the microspores will separate from each other and only after separation the development of the microspore will take place this is something that we have studied do you remember at the very beginning the microspores the four microspores that we are talking about remember the word called as tetran
Yes, ma'am.
right so the tetran of microspores will remain fused with each other later they will separate from each other but sometimes what happens all the microspores in one anther lobe do not separate and fuse together and this is what is called as pollination all the microspores of one anther lobe remains fused with each other that is what is called as pollination and pollination is commonly seen in orchids is it clear now
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
okay right so it was Gycogami next is heterostyly right what is heterostyly different length of styles and stamens so self-pollination if it has to occur then the length should also be in a proper position or the length should be same right if suppose we are talking about a flower in which suppose we are talking about a flower in which the stigma is high above and the anther is here right so for the pollen beads to from here to reach here it is not easy right so in this case if the height does not match then their flower is bound to undergo cross pollination and this difference in length of the style and the stamen is called as heterostyly মানে male reproductive part and the female reproductive part are of different length and so self pollination does not become easy is it clear
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, yes, ma'am.
seen in flowers like jasmine primrose primula etc right so this is the fifth condition sixth is prepotency
Ma'am, আপুনি যে ক'লে হেটেৰোষ্টাইলিত ডিফাৰেণ্ট লেংথ অফ ষ্টাইলছ এণ্ড ষ্টেমেন তাতে মেম ষ্টেমেনৰ লেংথটো বেছি হ'ব পাৰে তেতিয়াতো চেল্ফ পলিনেশ্যনটো মানে হ'ব
Staminal length to বেশি হব পাৰে কিন্তু বহুত যদি সাপৰকে আছে gynosphere ডাল কেতিয়াবা কি হয় when the anther bursts the pollen grains are carried away by the wind. So যেতিয়া উইন্ডৰ লগত গুচি যায় the very less chances of falling into the stigma. Proper position থাকিলে কি হ'ব anther টো যেতিয়া ফাটিব ফাটি যোৱাৰ লগে লগে stigma পৰি যাব যদি stigma টো বহুত তলত আছে তেতিয়া pollen grains বোৰ with together with wind what they will happen they will be carried away. So chances of cell proliferation becomes very less. So it is essential that the heights are of equal length. একেবাৰে নহব বুলি ক'ব নোৱাৰা কিন্তু chances কম.
Yes, ma'am.
Clear? Okay. The next factor is prepotency. তাত লিখা pollen grains of one flower germinates more rapidly over stigma of another flower as compared so a statement to পঢ়া আছে প্ৰথমতে just read the statement see what you understood. Prepotency means what? We are talking about one condition. For example, we have a plant here, we have a flower here, and we have a plant here, and here also we have a flower. So in this flower, you will have the male reproductive part, and you will have the female reproductive part also. This is the male reproductive part, and this is the female reproductive part. Similarly, in this case also, you will have the male reproductive part and you will have the female reproductive part. What happens is, sometimes what happens when this anther bursts, this anther or the pollen grains that are present, they will fall into its own flower or they might fall into the gynosphere of the other flower also. Are you understanding? We are talking about two conditions, right? So if you are talking about this flower, this is the anther will burst and the pollen grains will be dispersed in the air. So these pollen grains might fall in its own gynosphere or it might fall in the gynosphere of some other flower. So in that condition, sometimes it is observed then when the pollen grain falls in the other flower, the germination is faster as compared to this one. So each and every plant has a motive of faster germination so that they can form seeds easily and so that they can form their offspring. Adult planter, what is the main aim? The main aim of a plant is obviously to produce their offspring at a faster rate so that they can increase their number, right? So what happens is sometimes this type of a condition is also seen where the pollen grains takes a longer time to fertilize this one. It takes a shorter time to fertilize this one. So obviously this flower or this one will always get encouraged or will always fertilize by cross-pollination. So that condition is called as prepotency. If you have understood the explanation, now read the sentence. The pollen grains of one flower germinates more rapidly over stigma of another flower as compared to its own flower. Is the point clear?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Everyone? So, yate, jetya poribo, maybe it will take 5 years to germinate. Suppose if this pollen grains falls here, it will germinate immediately. So, which one will be more favorable? Obviously, this one. So such a condition is called as prepotency. In certain types of plants where prepotency is observed, cross-pollination is a method of pollination instead of self-pollination. Clear? Next, we come to the last one. The last factor which we will read that encourages cross-pollination. We have a term called as self-incompatibility, and this term or this factor needs certain explanations. So I think since we don't have time today, the time is almost over. This is something that we are going to explain it in the next class. So out of all the factors that encourages cross-pollination, I mean, except this one will be covered in the next class. Will that be okay?
Okay,
Yes,
ma'am.
ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you for today.
Thank you, ma'am.
Bye, ma'am.
Any doubts? Wow.
Thank you, ma'am.
Was there anyone asking me a doubt?
Nahi, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am.
Okay. Thank you.